one of the most often forgotten and I'd say unexpected for myself plot elements that we saw in The Marvelous Land of Oz is one that takes place near the end of the book. To most modern readers, it's a theme that's going to show up and kind of be shocking and at least be uncomfortable. Now, I suspect in 1904, when the book was released, it was just one more way to have a creative extra layer of strangeness and disorienting strangeness to accompany these discoveries about the wizard, because we find out that the wizard had actually stolen the throne of Oz from the good king Pastoria, probably contributed to the death of the good king, and that Oz had delivered Pastoria's heir into the hands of the evil witch Mombi. So this plot element that accompanies that, it's so unusual that it comes as little surprise that it's one of the few important story elements that was completely left unrepresented in the 1985 loose film adaptation Return to Oz. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. So the main character of the book, Tip, a little boy, is revealed to be the true royal princess of the land, who was actually transformed into a boy by the witch Mombi in order to conceal her true identity, Princess Ozma's true identity. What's perhaps most striking about this portrayal is not actually the unexpected revelation, but it's how the characters respond to this discovery. The setup provides a disorienting contrast, you could say, between reality as perceived and reality as it actually is. So we end up in a situation where the characters, Tip in particular, have to choose between, to use a Matrix reference, they have to choose between the red pill and the blue pill. And Glinda gives the choice to the one person who has the most to gain or lose by it, but also the person who, could we really expect somebody to make a choice so quickly? And that's Tip himself. The choice goes on him. It's hard to tell which is more surprising. A, the discovery that the main character of the story is actually a glorious princess like none we've ever seen before in Oz, or the plot development in which Tip actually accepts this reality and he's willing to step into the unknown even though he knows he can never come back again. I can't help but read this section of the book from the framework within modern psychology, the framework of emotional and cognitive acceptance, because that really seems to jump off the pages. So a little bit of context. The field of psychology has recently moved toward increasing interest in the study of acceptance, especially while CBT, the traditional evidence-based staple of cognitive behavior therapy, has been succeeded by these kind of carefully crafted successors which prioritize acceptance. And that would be, on the top of the list would be dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. And so something that psychological researchers are increasingly focusing on in recent years, you could say it's a theme that certainly people have been aware of throughout all of history, most of history. And I think you can really see similar categories of thought in these final sections of Land of Oz. So when faced with a situation that most individuals would find distressing, Tip, his initial response is to express his desire, which culminates in this specific objection: I don't want to be a girl. And who would? All his life, he has only known one thing, namely the comfortable life under the sway of the witch's enchantment. The thought of changing into something fundamentally different is so disorienting that it's distressing. It's an assault on his very sense of identity. And this identity, it's not just private or personal. For Tip, it's relational. And he experiences a terror of the relational consequences of losing the only selfhood that he's ever experienced. Now, where the principle or the topic of acceptance comes into view is when we find, with, let's say, an even greater shock than the shock of discovery that he's a princess, then we find that he's operating with acceptance mode. So instead of crumbling into a fight or flight battle against his own feelings, it seems that he's able to express himself clearly, I don't want to be a girl, and also to look the world straight in the face. Despite knowing nothing about the unmatched glory of his true identity as Ozma, he's still willing to stand face to face looking at the ugliest truth without lashing out against it inside. And then perhaps more importantly, he's willing to stand face to face with his own feelings, his own inner self and subjective reactions with a non-combative kindness. And then for some reason, when it comes time to make a choice in relation to these feelings and beliefs, he ends up choosing to follow truth and reality as he best understands it, even though he knows he can never go back once he's made that choice. Perhaps it becomes easier for Tip to practice acceptance in this situation and make the choice that accords most with his values. Perhaps it becomes easier because of the acceptance that he experiences socially. As I pointed out before, we can reasonably infer that he was experiencing distress, not just about the private and personal identity implications of this discovery, but also of the social and relational implications. It's not just that he's afraid of the sickening disorientation of looking down at himself and finding something other than the self that he knows and sees to be right. But it's also that he's afraid of the sickening disorientation of finding himself looking over at his friends and wondering what kind of self they see. The experience of having no idea what will become of his existence in relation to the community. So the Tin Woodman, in characteristic fashion as the character with the biggest heart, says, "Never mind, old chap, it don't hurt to be a girl, I'm told, and we all remain your faithful friends just the same. And to be honest with you, I've always considered girls nicer than boys." Kind of a fitting comment, because if you remember, the Tin Woodman's motivations in Book 1 were all centered around this particular girl who he was in love with, so no wonder he thinks girls are nice. But his comments to Tip reveal that he didn't just value the girl he fell in love with because of all the fickle emotions and biochemical impulses that made him want to marry her. He also values girls and women because of who they are as unique and distinctive people, apart from any romantic or sexual feelings of any kind. The way he sees it, if he has a good friend who's a boy like Tip, or if he has a good friend who's a girl like Dorothy or Ozma, he would love that person just the same. He'd love his friend just the same. And then, of course, that extra bit that he probably doesn't normally say to people, but apparently he decided it would be okay to admit in this situation. He says, all things being equal, girls tend to be nicer than boys. And the Scarecrow, he manages to politely agree while disagreeing, because his next line is, "Well, they're just as nice anyway," as he pats Tip affectionately on the head. And then the Wogglebug, he takes his turn and he points out that girls are equally good students, and that I should like to become your tutor when you are transformed into a girl again. Jack Pumpkinhead, on the other hand, who has always thought of Tip as his father, he cries out with a gasp of distress, "If you become a girl, you can't be my dear father anymore." And to that, Tip makes no objection, and he turns to Glinda and continues to contemplate the decision. I think that this story, reflecting human nature the way it does, kind of this basic part of human nature, we could say it contains a rich and powerful allegorical message for all of us. We could take this allegorically and turn it over and say, psychologically and spiritually, we do find ourselves, all of us find ourselves in situations where truth and reality are kind of unwelcome. We find ourselves in places where we don't want to look at reality with an attitude of acceptance, and we certainly don't want to look inwardly at our own disconcerted feelings with acceptance and openness. We find that we want to fight hard to protect our sense of who we ought to be, who we find most comfort in seeing ourselves to be. And we want to fight hard to protect our sense of what we want to see around us. But we could say that the story suggests that through an attitude of acceptance, through a love for truth and reality, maybe we could suggest, what if there's a more glorious reality on the other side of the journey, the calming but difficult journey of learning to be uncomfortable, so that we can gradually become comfortable with the uncomfortable? What if through an attitude of acceptance, through a love for truth and reality, what if there's a more glorious reality on the other side of the calming but difficult journey of learning to be uncomfortable, so that we can gradually become comfortable with that discomfort? In the case of Tip and Ozma, you can barely help wanting to shout through the pages to Tip you're more glorious than you could ever imagine. You've been enchanted and forced to live in this limited reality that seems like it's everything that counts. You're stuck in this comfortable, familiar, but truncated version of reality. So it's natural you want to embrace it because it's all you can see. But the glory and dignity that's just out of sight is off the charts. Royalty and reality just feel sickening and demeaning, don't they? Well, allegory aside, there's no question that this whole plot element in Land of Oz is not modern, that's for sure. It's definitely going to stir up some pretty strong feelings in most modern readers. After all, it's shocking and unexpected, not just to find out that this young person was forced into a gender identity against his will, but also to see him forced to make a permanent life decision on such short notice. Whatever the case, however, you can't help wanting to give the Tin Woodman a great big hug. Because he basically told Tip, for all practical purposes, I know it's hard for you to make this insane decision. I mean, inner acceptance is so hard to come by. He basically said, no matter how much acceptance you can manage getting on inside of you, I'm going to give you my acceptance, my relational social acceptance. And you're going to be one of my favorite little friends no matter what gender you are.